First up, local news in many places is on the critical list, but there are people trying to attach an IV. It's an issue I care about a lot, in part because I spend 3.5 hours a day on radio and TV, most days talking about things I read in the newspaper. But it's an issue you should care a lot about too, because when even one journalism job is lost, much less a whole paper, that's one less person digging for the truth and holding public officials and institutions accountable. Since 2004, the U.S. has seen a 60% decline in journalists and lost more than 2,000 newspapers, according to the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media, leaving hundreds of areas without access to reliable, credible local news coverage. And while we've fared a bit better right here in Massachusetts, we have lost close to 30% of local papers around the state during that time. Next month, Gannett is either cutting back or merging more than 20 other Massachusetts weeklies, including in Newton, Somerville, Billerica, Norwood, and Waltham. Thankfully, there's still some efforts to fill the void, like Report for America initiative, which was launched back in 2017 and puts journalists in newsrooms across the country with the mission of covering underserved issues and communities. One of the people behind it is Charlie Sennott. Charlie's also the founder of the Ground Truth Project here at GBH. He's here. I'm also joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and former editor of the Chicago Tribune, Anne-Marie Lipinski, who's now the curator for Harvard's Nieman Foundation for Journalism. Anne-Marie and Charlie, it's good to see you both.
Good to see you, Jim.
Anne-Marie, Gannett says they're not eliminating coverage, they're just shutting down print. Everything is going to be there online. You buying what they're selling?
Well, it is true that they're eliminating some print and you can find other things online. It's also true that they're merging newspapers. I would say the third piece that is the most concerning, and that if you live in one of these communities, you should be most concerned about, is the fact that they are going to make a lot of their local reporters into regional reporters. So people who have previously been dedicated to a beat, maybe covering schools or City Hall or something like that, will now be doing this for a broader set of communities. And it is impossible to maintain the level of coverage they had if you do that.
Charlie, even though Newton, I mentioned, is obviously an affluent community, when you look across the country, the vast majority of places that are losing local news coverage are low and moderate income communities, are they not?
That's right. I mean, you think about what we've lost here in Massachusetts. As you pointed out, it's almost 30% of local news organizations have been fading out over time. Across the country, it's closer to 60%. It's a collapse of an industry that's akin to the collapse of the coal industry. The numbers are actually higher in newspapers. But we're not hearing this story enough. We're not thinking about what it means to lose those local news organizations, and it's really powerful.
What does it mean?
We know three things happen, and there's really good data on this now. We know voter participation will decline. We know polarization will increase. And a really interesting one is that we know banks are going to lower the bond ratings of those places that don't have local newspapers, because banks ask the question, like, how can you trust a community where there's no one watching the store? And that's really what this comes down to, is we don't have local reporters in town hall asking the hard questions. They might fill up on regional beats, but that's not the same as being there digging in the local communities. We need that if we're going to have a democracy.
You know, Anne-Marie, I was a city councilor for one term in Cambridge, and I like to think that I generally did the right thing because I'm a fairly honorable person. But I'd be lying if I told you that part of it was because I was being watched. And I think that's human nature. You write a piece for Nieman Reports, which is great, called Green Light for Corruption. Could you flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, I think that journalists have been making a case that has been very kind of sounds a little self-centered. Our jobs are being lost. There are too many layoffs. Salaries are down. And I think we need to reframe this for the real cost, attributed to the community now. And so there's a researcher at the Harvard Business School named Jonas Heese, who is a researcher on corruption. And he took an interest in what happens in a community when a newspaper closes down. So I went to talk to him, and he had looked at 33 local communities and sort of regulatory agencies across the US, and tried to look at what happens when a paper closes. And he was surprised, but I don't think most journalists would be surprised to find that violations and penalties went up across these 44 government agencies. And the violation number was relatively small, but the penalty number was much greater. So 15% increase in financial penalties, for instance, across, or 20% for something like toxic admissions. Yeah. So he saw increases in toxic admission penalties, in the cost of borrowing, in the cost to shareholders, in job violations. So, just fair employment violations, discrimination, accounting fraud, overbilling, pollution. And he said it's just the tip of the iceberg. He only looked at publicly traded companies. He didn't look at private companies. And Jimmy said exactly what you just said. His assumption is that when you're being watched, you're just more careful and you're more conscientious.
Well, mine was anecdotal, but his evidence, what you write about, is far from it. Can we spend a few minutes on solutions? Charlie, explain briefly, if you can, what Report for America is. What's its intention? What are you doing?
So what we're trying to do is take emerging journalists and put them in the field in communities that need local reporters. This is a call to service. This is basically saying, we want you in these local communities. We want you serving there. So the way it works is we put out the call to news organizations and we ask them, where is an undercovered part of your community that really needs coverage? How can you assure us it's going to be public service driven and that you'll actually have editing and mentoring? And then once we select the newspapers, we then put out the call to journalists, to young journalists mostly. Our average age is about 26. And we are flooded with applications. We were doing about 1,000 applications for every 50 slots. And right now, as of June, we'll be putting our biggest cohort out, 325 journalists in more than 220 newsrooms across 50 states. We have 20 who are here in Massachusetts at the Boston Globe, at WCAI, Springfield Public Radio, the Berkshire Eagle. And those are news organizations that are holding on. They're doing well, but there's so many that are suffering. And, I live in Newton right now, and the tab is closing on May 4th. And when that happens, the day after World Press Freedom Day, we lose so much when we lose these newspapers.
There are other solutions. Well, I don't know if it is a solution. We interviewed people, Anne-Marie, a couple of months ago from the New Bedford Light, which is a volunteer nonprofit, and it's the individual experience sounded great to me, but it basically depends upon the goodness of strangers, that model, no?
Yeah, and I do think back to Charlie's earlier comments, you're probably going to get greater participation in communities where people are better off, where they can take time to volunteer, where they're not beholden to a clock at their job, and so I think it's just we're creating an elite form of coverage that will not be available to all communities.
Well, Anne-Marie, I want to ask you about one more if I can. I don't know how the acronym came about. Local Journalism Sustainability Act, LISA, again, I don't quite get where the I comes from. But this was originally a bipartisan effort in Congress with much hope, and it sort of floundered, as most things do in Congress. Tax breaks to news operations that hire or retain local journalists, to businesses that advertise, to real people who do subscriptions. It doesn't appear to be going anywhere, but as a model, is it something you're comfortable with, Anne-Marie?
It's such a great question, Jim, and my thinking about this has evolved. And once you look at something like the Harvard Business School research and see that you're being taxed anyway, effectively, right? A newspaper goes out of business, corruption goes up, fines go up, the government has to, monitor these things to a greater degree. There is a cost to society that's now being documented. And so you can pay now or you can pay later. I'd prefer to, and this is where my thinking has really changed, to support these efforts that are fundamental to a healthy democracy. There's just no question about it.
Jim, quick point if I could. What's going on is newspapers are realizing, and local news organizations, a lot of them are digital startups, like you pointed out in New Bedford. But what we're seeing is that the nonprofit model is going to play a much bigger role in journalism. And I think that's a good thing. I'm in GBH right now. This is one of the great models of nonprofit journalism. And I would push back on the idea that it only serves the elite. We're seeing across the country that local foundations in some very distressed areas like Appalachia, rural Ohio, the local foundations are stepping up. We're doing what are called community news funds. And that is to pull the communities together, because communities are recognizing that their local government, the way they work together as a community, the way they hold together, is bound into having local news organizations that give them shared sets of facts. So we think the nonprofit sector is going to really grow. I don't think that's just the elite or a handout. I think it's a way to serve communities, and they're seeing they need it, and I think they're bounding together.
Well, some
around
people
it.
are concerned about the coverage that those entities can do of the institutions that fund them. We only have a minute left. Starting with you, Anne Marie, can you do a little Nostradamus for 5 years out? Where are we on the local newspaper scene?
I think things get worse before they get better, but we are going to see, we're growing a set of examples and models for what might work going forward. And I think that's really exciting. What I would say is that the public needs to be far more demanding about this, and that you would never tolerate a lack of, fire department services in your community or a schoolhouse.
Yeah.
We need to demand this as again, an essential part of a functioning democracy, and including demanding it from these vulture funds and others who have assumed ownership of so many of these newspapers.
Charlie, I have 30 seconds for Nostradamus
I agree with everything
time.
that Anne Marie just said, but I would add that we also have to get better at telling the story ourselves as journalists. This really matters. We got to get out there and share the story. And I think the new models for nonprofit, digital-first news organizations are going to start to flourish. And I think they're the ones to watch. And we're going to have to support them through public policy and through these new nonprofit models supporting them.
Charlie Sennott, Anne Marie Lipinski, as always, good to see you both. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jim.
Jim.
For more information on Charlie's organization, head to reportforamerica.org.